organizing this very important and timely conference. As EBRD, we're proud to be part of this, and you will see during the day that there will be quite a number of our staff who will be here to respond to also your questions on the panel, but also among you. So please make use of that. And of course, you have Andrei Kusvek, who's my predecessor for many, many years, who knows Ukraine inside out, is also on this panel. And his present responsibility has a very significant bearing for what we are also trying to do in Ukraine to enhance the domestic capital markets and improve the financing in local currency of Ukraine. This meeting is very important, and I said timely, because there is a clear need to keep the story, the message of Ukraine in front of everybody's mind in a way that is not polluted by the propaganda and a lot of noise that is very prevalent in recent times. So I think for this reason alone that your presence here is very important for the country. I think some people are asking, how can I invest in an environment like this at this moment in time? I think this conference is not just to attract investment, but also to instill confidence in international businessmen that Ukraine can deliver. So it's not just about inbound investment, but also outbound exports of Ukraine that is very important for its economy to diversify away from a very major dependency on Russia and develop new markets. So I hope that the message here will be carried in that respect as well. Ukraine is going through a tough period, of course, because it is clearly reorientated itself in an irrevocable way towards the West, towards Europe, towards a very clear market economy where the rule of law and international rule of law will prevail. We know the history is bad. We had a very corrupt government that pretty much destroyed the country and brought it to this position. But I also want to look forward and look forward with a great hope on the back of the resolve that this government and Mr. Poroshenko has shown to initiate the reforms, the tough economic and financial and institutional reforms that the country needs. Of course, when your resources are sapped away as a result of the sabotage that is being attempted to this process, then it is time for the friends of Ukraine to stand up and provide additional support. And I think, and I believe that not only the IMF program that is a significant one by any measure, but there will be additional resources that Ukraine's friends will put to its availability in order to address this leakage that is caused by the very virtuous fight to preserve the country's territorial integrity. EBRD is standing firmly with Ukraine at this very crucial point in its history, as it always did in the past. We will provide, as Mr. Ambassador has pointed out, substantial amount of money in the next 5, 6, 7 years. This year, we have the plan and we are on target to deliver 1 billion euro of new investment money into Ukraine across a range of sectors: agribusiness, infrastructure, energy, financial institutions, information technology, etc. My purpose as a director is to further engage with the smaller and medium enterprise spectrum of the Ukrainian economy and to go into the regions. And of course, once the present conflict is brought down to a manageable level, that we will be also part, of course, of the reconstruction of the East, the infrastructure in particular. EBRD's support and standing with Ukraine is not only limited to financial resources. Equally important is the policy dialogue and the technical assistance we are able to mobilize across the entire spectrum of the country's need to help this reform and transformation process. That process is backed, of course, not only with EBRD money, but with the donors' money. And recently, we are putting in place now a multi-donor fund, which your countries, including UK, are contributing significant amounts so that we can provide that assistance to Ukraine. I don't want to take much of your time. I just want to say that EBRD is ready to support you with your investments, be it in the form of equity, be it in the form of debt, be it in the form of project preparation, technical assistance to make it happen. So please call me, call my colleagues who are going to be here. Andre is here. I'll be here during the day. We are here to help this country get back to the position it deserves in the Western world. So I thank you for your interest and wish you the best of luck with your conference today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shevki. And I would not like to introduce our speaker in National Bank of Ukraine, Alexander Pisaruk, with whom we will have an online video call. And I would like to introduce our moderator and Hunter, the director of the Ukrainian Institute in London and head of JAR, Sen Kakharenko. Andy, please.
Thank you, Maria. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I understand we have Alexander Pisaruk online, and he'll be with us for the next 10 minutes. So if we can bring him on the screen, and then I'll introduce the panel. Or in the meantime, I'll introduce the panel. Yeah, okay. I arrived back from Kyiv on Friday, and on Saturday morning, Alexander, добрый день. Good morning. London here. Can you hear us?
Yes. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Yes.
Good morning. Well, welcome. We have the conference here in London, and everyone is very much following events in Ukraine, and everyone's interested to hear what's happening, especially with the National Bank of Ukraine and with the local currency. So if you can just give us a brief overview of what's happening, what you're doing, and what your forecasts are, both short and midterm.
Well, first of all, I would like to mention that I'm very pleased to participate in this conference. It's very good to see for us that investors keep faith in Ukraine and maintain their interest in the country. Clearly, we have to admit that the economic outlook in the very short term has significantly deteriorated, largely and predominantly because of the military conflict in the eastern Ukraine. At the same time, we believe that we could expect certain stabilization in 2015 and gradual recovery in the longer term. And we also think that Ukraine remains to be an attractive investment opportunity in the medium and the long term, because all the fundamental advantages and strength of Ukraine actually remain. We're going through a very rough and difficult period, but I think it's also quite positive to see that this period in our history actually triggered quite some improvement in the governance of the country. It triggered quite some facilitation of a structural reforms that have been on the agenda for many, many years and never initiated. So we clearly see the effort to clean up endemic corruption and fight bureaucracy and implement long-needed structural reform. And it's true to say that it remains to be seen to what extent the country will be successful in implementing those, particularly given that we have to fight the daily problems arising from the current conflict. But we remain to be optimistic, and we think that the country will show its resilience and strength and will be able to recover in the medium to long term.
Okay, thank you. What about the hryvnia? I mean, what's the exchange rate this morning, and what's your forecast for the next month?
So the exchange rate of hryvnia is today, the quotations in bid and sell is about 12.4 to 12.9. You see that the currency has regained ground. So it became a result effectively of the joint effort from the central bank and the largest commercial banks. But we are pleased to see the results indeed.
And forecasts for the next month?
Well, I wish I could give you a forecast. I mean, as you know, the main affecting factor is the military operation in eastern Ukraine and ongoing negotiations about the peaceful resolution of this crisis. I think that will have a significant impact on the future forecast, but we hope that in the near future, in the next few weeks, we will be able to maintain this level of exchange rate.
Okay, if anybody would like to ask Mr. Pisaruk any questions, please feel free to do so. The question regarding the mandatory sale of foreign currency of corporates operating in Ukraine. How long do you think that this will there be any measures to sort of review this, or will it be in any way changed or removed at all in any way?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would like to mention that this particular measure, as well as other temporary restrictions that the National Bank of Ukraine had to introduce, are indeed temporary. The central bank management is very market-oriented management, so we are very keen to abolish them as soon as practically possible. So, but that again largely depends on the peaceful resolution of the conflict in eastern Ukraine, which has a major impact on the banking and financial sector and on the market. We estimate that we should be able to unwind it within the next 3 months, but again, it depends on the political military development.
Okay, any questions to Mr. Pisaruk? And then, final then question in terms of the, you mentioned the commercial banks and the health and the state of the commercial banks at the moment. And what are the plans for any potential stress tests to be taken onto these banks, and in terms of refunding or refinancing from the government into the commercial banks?
Yeah. As you know, we have an ongoing stress testing of, at the moment, 15 largest commercial banks in accordance with the methodology which was agreed with the International Monetary Fund. We are now looking at the preliminary results and discussing the capitalization programs with the respective banks. It is true to say that given the significantly changed environment in Ukraine this year, that the initial assumptions behind the stress test remain a little bit outdated. So we will see to what extent we could accommodate this fact in the recapitalization programs, and we will discuss it with the IMF.
Okay, well, thank you. If there are no more questions, I would like to thank you, Mr. Pisaruk, on behalf of everybody here in London, and wish you all the best of success in these extremely challenging times. And we look forward to seeing you in London very soon. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, thank you. As I mentioned, I came back from Ukraine on Friday night, and on Saturday morning I went to my car and I had a flat battery. So I called out the AA, the Vehicle Recovery Service, and he managed to fix it, and I told him I hadn't used the car for a while, and he asked, "Where were you all this time?" And I said, I was in Ukraine. And he looked at me with sort of astonishment. I said, "Are you crazy?" It was the perception of the country today, what we have in the public eyes, and also especially in the eyes of the investors. So I think I would like to initially thank the organizers of A7 and Maria Marabash for organizing this event this morning, today, and the events that will take place also tomorrow. And I would like to welcome this distinguished panel, who will give an overview of the realities of what's going on, and what the challenges and the opportunities are. As has been mentioned already today, Ukraine is very much at war. This is a hybrid war in the 21st century, and it's a war that not only we see the military, Russian troops on sovereign Ukrainian soil. This is also an economic war by Russia towards Ukraine. This is a political war, and an information war. What was mentioned about the propaganda that's being laid out against Ukraine in media in Russia, in Ukraine, and in markets all over the world. So I think it's opportunities like this where we can discuss and really provide more sourced information on really what's going on and the opportunities of what's around. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome my furthest right is Timothy Ash. Many of you know Timothy. Timothy is head of emerging markets research at Standard Bank in London. Standard Bank's global operations were actually recently bought by ICBC, the largest bank in China. Tim has covered Ukraine and emerging Europe for 26 years. He lived in Ukraine in the mid-1990s and frequently visits and writes about Ukraine and political and economical challenges it faces. He's a regular contributor to the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Kyiv Post, and the international press and media. And his client base is preliminary amongst international institutional investors. Andrei Krushvik, many of you know also from his many years he spent in Ukraine as country manager at the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. Andrei is now here in London, and he is Director of Local Currency and Capital Markets Development at the EBRD. And I'd like to welcome Yanika Merillo, Managing Director of the Center of Ukraine European Development and Integration. Yanika spends time between her native Estonia and Kyiv. Yes, she's native Ukraine. So spending time between Tallinn and Kyiv. So without further ado, in terms of time, we have 60 minutes. So may I suggest we have 10 minutes on each, and if you'd like to give an overview of what's happening and what you're seeing. Sorry, yes. My understanding, it's open, unless Maria, you would like to say something? Yes. So anything that says in this room is publicly quoted, and you will be quoted with in the press. Yes. Right. Well, can we take questions at the end? Right.
I think one of the things as investors that you should realize with EBRD, and this is a great comment for EBRD and both speakers this morning, is I don't think investors realize that they can partner their money with EBRD, and I would like to see EBRD promote themselves. Like in our company, we realize that there's many different banks and many different IFIs, and I work with EBRD directly, where you can take a small amount of money and really parlay that with the IFIs, EBRD, Ukrainian banks, and really make a small investment go a long way in Ukraine and make a great return. And I just wanted to make those comments before we got going, because I think EBRD is a great promotion, and there's great IFIs, and there's lots of big money coming in, but if you structure it correctly, you can make real advantages for small money with those partnerships, and I just wanted to impart that.
Thank you for your comments, much appreciated. I think we'll be able to sort of liaise and sort of discuss on that further. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand the floor to Timothy Ash.
Hey, at Chatham House Rules, I've never held by that anyway, so I usually say what I think anyway and get into lots of trouble anyway, so I won't stop a pretty good habit. I mean, maybe you've just seen the news flow, but basically there was a report over the media that Poroshenko agreed a permanent ceasefire with Putin on a phone call that they had presumably this morning, and then Putin basically put out a statement saying that he's not party to the peace agreement or the ceasefire agreement because Russia's obviously not involved in the conflict in Ukraine. So it's interesting news flow this morning. Ukraine is very difficult to read. I mean, everyone's got Ukraine wrong. I mean, we've done various seminars together in the last few months. Now, this is just incredible what we're seeing, right? I mean, it's very difficult for analysts like myself to predict, plan, forecast what's going on in Ukraine. We saw the IMF report came out yesterday. I mean, totally got their forecasts utterly wrong. I mean, they set the wrong assumptions in the start in terms of the conflict in the East. But you know, it's very difficult to read. It's very difficult, obviously, for investors to read. And I guess it's quite ambitious to run a conference at the moment looking at investment opportunities in Ukraine. I guess focusing on the positives for me when I look at Ukraine at the moment, I'd argue that what I'm seeing is some big pluses. The first thing is I think this administration is the best administration I've seen in Ukraine since independence. I mean, they get a lot of criticism from people that they're as corrupt as the other guys, etc. But actually, I think Poroshenko has exceeded expectations. I think in office, he's been quite measured, quite pragmatic. You know, I mean, he's facing an incredibly difficult challenge, both in terms of domestic politics, but also in terms of the external threat. And let's face it, he's a relatively inexperienced leader. He's had lots of positions in various ministries, obviously head of the National Security Council, foreign minister, all that kind of thing, but heading a country is a little bit different, and especially when you are facing invasion, and that's clearly what it is. But I think across the board, I mean, I think Gonchareva, the new central bank governor, is a breath of fresh air. For an instant, I'm just looking if we have the link from the National Bank of Ukraine. Do we have it? Okay, we don't. So, I mean, my impression is the National Bank of Ukraine has been the worst central bank in the whole region by far. And I think Gonchareva, it needs a root and branch clear out across the board. And I think Gonchareva is the kind of person to do that. And I'm incredibly encouraged. So, shall I take it?
Yeah, take it a little bit louder. Yeah.
Okay. You know, I'm incredibly encouraged that she was chosen, great choice. She understands it. She's not a monetary economist by training. You don't need to be a central bank governor. You need to be a good manager, and you need to hire the right kind of people. I mean, a good manager, you know, it's about delegating, and I think someone who can absolutely do that. So I think, you know, we have a decent administration for the first time. I think Russia has done Ukraine a huge favour in many respects. Putin, by his very aggressive stance towards Ukraine, has created a nation. I mean, I've written, and you know, this is Ukraine's. You know, we could debate how Ukraine got independence and whether there was really an independence movement, but basically, the aggression shown towards Ukraine by Russia has forged a nation. I mean, Ukrainians finally feel that they are a nation and that they're fighting for independence. It's like 1776, 1861, 1848. 2014 is the year that Ukraine was forged, and I think that's really important. And you certainly sense, and it was mentioned by, I think, one of the speakers actually, that you sense a real desire by Ukrainians to take the pain, to do the right kind of things, to fend off Russian aggression. You know, all the difficult things on the economic front that need to be done, they will do it. I mean, they're willing to take gas price hikes, fiscal austerity. You know, if you look at the IMF program, basically they put in the call to Washington, and whatever the IMF told them to do, they did, without complaining about it. I mean, just let's get a program in place as quickly as possible. Whatever you tell us to do, we'll do it. Just give us the money. And okay, I have some question marks about the program. Mostly my questions are to the IMF, not to the Ukrainian administration, but essentially it shows a willingness to do really, really difficult things. And then, you know, so decent administration finally, a population that's a new country that's been forged, and a willingness to do difficult things. And I see that across the country. I mean, I'm not sure who we have in the audience here. I need to be quite careful what I say typically, but what struck me in recent months, and it surprised me, has been, and I'm sure if you go to Donetsk and Luhansk, you can find people who support the separatists. But what surprised me is that, you know, I'd say 90, actually all the people I've met from Ukraine tell me the same story. We don't support Russian intervention. We don't support separatism. This is a Russian intervention. Even people I know who, I have to admit, I do know some people in the former Yanukovych regime, and I still talk to them. But even those guys are telling me something quite remarkable, that they don't support it. They have assets in Donetsk and Luhansk, and the separatists have been seizing cars, threatening staff. You know, they describe them as bandits. and the fact that guys like Akhmetov is in Kiev, can't go back to Donetsk, I think tells a particular story. So I think, again, this idea, this is a nation has certainly been forged, founded, and I think that creates some hope. And the positives we all know. I mean, Ukraine, huge country, heart of Europe, 43 million people, great skill base, great opportunities in agriculture, in energy. I mean, there's lots of things going for it if the Russians gave Ukraine a chance. I mean, this country can do really well, and I think its Western orientation is central to that. And a lot of people, I mean, you hear so much bullshit, frankly, about Ukraine. I mean, sorry about my phraseology, but it's the reality. I mean, the number of clients, the number of investors that come to me are people that I thought should know better. And they say, Ukraine, it's Russian anyway, right? I mean, it's incredible. I mean, the lack of understanding. I mean, and they say, well, the West was wrong in forcing Ukraine to choose at Vilnius. Forcing Ukraine to choose between East and West. And my answer to that is fairly clear-cut, right? I mean, bottom line is, Poland chose the European course, right? And its per capita GDP is $14,000 a head. Russia chose a different course, sovereign democracy, power vertical, whatever you want to call it, but its capita GDP is 14,000 per capita, or about that, it's about 16,000. Ukraine was held in this no man's land between East and West, this bridge between the West and Russia that people say is Ukraine's natural position. Its per capita GDP is 3,000. It's failed. This in-between state has just totally failed. And I think Ukraine had to make a choice. Okay, if it wanted to go east, fine. But the Ukrainian population decided to go west. The guys on Maidan, they're not stupid enough to think that this is about EU membership. The Europeans will disappoint Ukrainians, but Maidan wasn't about EU membership, it was about European values. It's about democracy, human rights, rule of law. It was about the population not being raped and pillaged by their politicians, their greedy, corrupt politicians about them. And I think, that desire to live in a normal country, that the ordinary person has a chance and it's fair and just. I mean, I think, that's the Maidan spirit, and I think Ukrainians have it, and I think that gives a great deal of hope for the future. Now, unfortunately, the hope is that somehow the West helps Ukraine to fend off this brutal Russian aggression, to enable delivery on those values that are fantastic values and that we should support. Unfortunately, I mean, I think, your Ambassador Schreiber, I think, made a very, the West is showing, I could use lots of expletives to describe the Western approach to Ukraine. Disappointing, weak, feeble, embarrassing, frankly. As a British person, I find it utterly embarrassing that a country that so desires to move towards a society based on Western values, European values, whatever they are, but anyway, European values, and we are disappointing the population and surrendering to Russian aggression. I mean, I find that quite remarkable. Just a few things on the macro, maybe. I mean, I think, and it's already been mentioned, hugely challenging, no doubt about it. Deep recession this year. I don't really buy the IMF program very much in terms of its macro assumptions. They don't know what they're talking about, frankly, in terms of macro. No one does. Next year, I think there'll be an equally deep recession unless the conflict in the East is resolved. Wide budget deficit, huge financing requirements in fiscal space. I really do not know why Ukraine didn't look at debt restructuring at the outset. I mean, the IMF advice was ridiculous. Someone in Washington basically decided they didn't want a restructuring for whatever reason, whether it's lobbying by bondholders or whatever you want to describe it. But, what should Ukraine's priorities be, basically? This country is fighting for its very survival. What should they be? Should it be paying soldiers' salaries, buying arms, paying pensioners, paying foreign creditors that supported the previous Yanukovych regime? Hello, let's have a wake-up call. I mean, your priorities are national security, defense, and also, I mean, should you be forcing through a very brutal fiscal austerity program when actually, social and political stability at this time when your security is under threat should be absolutely central. And we saw the IMF revise their forecast in terms of general government debt to GDP ratios, from their very optimistic scenario in the original standby agreement from 56.5, nicely below the 60% public sector debt GDP threshold that the Russians put in. Now they're saying 68.5 and maybe 73, and if the conflict in the east deteriorates, goes to 83. Bottom line, Ukraine cannot sustain a public sector debt ratio of 73%. It never has done. It cannot do. I think it looks very much similar to a Greek-style scenario where the IMF kind of ignores the reality for a while, and then eventually they have to go back to a scenario where they restructure their debt liabilities. The other point I'd probably end my rant is, in terms of gas transit, clients always ask me about, the gas threat and Russia's pressure on Ukraine likely over the winter months in terms of, they've already cut off the gas supplies, but further squeezing it. I mean, in the end, Ukraine has some leverage. I mean, Russia cannot transit gas to Europe without Ukraine. And Ukraine is the first bid on the pipeline. So in the end, you can always siphon gas off, as you have done in the past. And if the Europeans basically, do not support you with sufficient cash financing, security guarantees, why should you transit their gas? I mean, I think the Ukrainians have basically said, it's your problem. You're responsible for gas transit. Buy the gas on the border from Russia, and then we'll do a deal to transit gas through our territory. I think that's quite a reasonable kind of scenario. I mean, Ukraine has such dreadful relationships with Russia. Why should you negotiate to transit European gas through your territory? Maybe the Europeans would begin to wake up a bit, and maybe you'd get a bit more support if you were a little less cooperative in terms of gas transit and supply. I'm always controversial, and I always get into lots of trouble. So anyway, I'll hand back to.
Thank you, Tim. Always. As always, great analysis, and I'm delighted on the optimism. And I think what we are hearing now, as Tim just said, the talks of a ceasefire. We'll see how it develops over the next couple of hours and days. As was mentioned, EBRD, one of the largest institutional investors the largest institutional investor in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to welcome Andrei Kushvek, who has lived in Ukraine for many years and can provide us an overview of what next for the EBRD in Ukraine and how you see things developing.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I indeed lived in Ukraine for 5 years, and to be honest, my heart keeps beating for Ukraine now during the difficult times. Many of my friends here in London, they say, look, you left Ukraine summer 2013. Wasn't that a good timing? And I'm actually thinking about it and think, I would rather like to be there now when, indeed things are changing, because I very much agree with Tim here that I think change was long overdue. Both the citizens of Ukraine as well as the businesses in Ukraine, they deserve the better Ukraine. The structure, the way it worked with, corruption, mistrust, it didn't work. I think it wasn't sustainable. So the change was inevitable. It's highly unfortunate that there was an external intervention, which is now making already a very difficult situation even more difficult to resolve. I suspected that it will be very hard to have a conference on Ukraine and talk about invest in Ukraine, because it's virtually impossible to convince foreign investors to go into a country that is being invited by its largest neighbor. But I would like to a little bit focus on what I'm doing at the moment, and how the global architecture of financing is changing, and how that both directly and indirectly affects Ukraine. Because to get the economy going, one needs to finance it, and one way to do it is a SOS call to IMF. The other way to do it in a long run, hopefully, is to basically be attractive enough for private sector, both local enterprises but also international enterprises, to come and invest in the country where wealth will be created. What's happening globally is that the recent crisis has essentially triggered kind of a political call to, if you want, punish bad bankers, or if you want, create more stable structures so that taxpayers' money will not be used to bail out depositors and sometimes banks. So what is happening is that the banks are required to hold a lot more capital against the risk exposures they take. And this has triggered a significant change both in the US, in Europe, and somewhat in Asia. What we see in the EBRD region, which is traditionally, Central and Eastern Europe, now also ranging all the way to Mongolia in the east, and North Africa further down in the west. Morocco is the most western country that we operate now in. And these countries largely have been affected by the same regulatory change, where even if locally the new capital requirements and liquidity requirements are not in place yet, but many of these countries operated essentially through foreign banks, either cross-border lending to the enterprises in those countries, or acquiring banks, as was the case in Ukraine, and then financing those banks to finance the economy. That model is broken, and it's it will never come back in a way it used to operate. However, there is a major dilemma globally. I think there is a lot of liquidity that we see. The interest rates are at their historic lows. So there is money that doesn't know where to go. At the same time, the risks continue to be very high. Ukraine is exactly one of the countries that has one of the lowest credit ratings, certainly in the EBRD region. Now, what to do in this situation? I think the only solution can be that the money is sitting there. The liquidity pockets will have to find a way to where the money is needed in the real economy, with enterprises directly, without the banks putting their own balance sheets at risk. And that is something that I'm now trying to promote and encourage as the EBRD Global Head for Local Currency and Capital Markets Development across all our 35 countries where we operate. Number of options are possible. Obviously, as I said, in the short term, it's highly difficult to talk about hryvnia financing because the interest rate difference is massive. And nobody can run a business that borrows at 40% or over sustainably. But in spite of the current difficulties, I think there are a number of long-term reforms that need to be put in place. We want to be seen as a partner to EBRD, not only as a direct investor in Ukraine, but also, as my colleague Shevki Jr. said, to encourage and create avenues where private sector can be funded either with a small EBRD participation or at the end without any EBRD participation. We have suggested to the Ukrainian authorities, to the National Bank and the government a very specific program how to promote over longer term Ukrainian hryvnia financing, how to create domestic institutional investor base, because unless you have domestic investors that are able and willing and able to invest long term, pension funds, insurance companies and so on, asset management, equity funds, foreign investors normally do not find the country attractive, just coming from abroad. There has to be some local liquidity. To create infrastructure, stock exchange, depository, etc. And then to create opportunities for bond issuances, where exactly the avenue where the money that is looking for return and the enterprises that want to attract funding can meet through the bond market rather than through bank intermediated financing. So this is what we are trying to focus on through my department. As to the rest of EBRD funding, you heard my colleague Shevki saying that we try to go back to a 1 billion euro financing it from the EBRD's own balance sheet on an annual basis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrei. And now I'm delighted to hand the floor to Janica Merillo. This session is about macroeconomic, but also about reforms. And I think we can focus now on the reforms, what has happened over the last 6 months, what hasn't happened over the last 6 months, and what may happen over the next 6, 12, 18 months. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand the floor to Janica.
Yes, thank you, Andy. Well, actually, I would like to just share my thoughts, and I would call it, it is not so much about reforms, but about creating the trust package. What does it mean? It means that citizens have to trust the government has to trust the municipalities, businesses have to trust the government, investors have to trust the Ukraine. And my microphone would have to work, thank you. So what do we mean by all this? Citizens have to trust the government. That means that you have to be sure that your rights are protected. It is very important to have the legal system working really. You have to have a new people in government. Today's government, we still believe, doesn't represent the will of the people today. So that's why we're having also the elections this autumn. When you have new people in place, there's more hope and belief that new things will happen. You cannot probably say to the person that has used to live in a certain way that, okay, you will have the same salary, but today you won't be corrupt anymore. It's old habits die hard, I'm sorry, which means you have to have new people in power. You have to listen to the new people. And the positive change is that Ukrainian government starts to listen to people more, starts to listen to citizens. Citizens have different kinds of initiatives. Reanimation package of reforms platform, which is very closely working with government on creating the new reforms. And it is a new shift really that the people are also considered to and listened to while implementing the changes. It's not only government to IMF, government to European Union, it's also government to people. And I believe it's a new shift and very positive. People have to trust government. That means less corruption, more transparency. And Vice Prime Minister Mr. Volodymyr Groysman, the agency for e-government has been established. I'm part of this team, happy to. And the aim of this agency is to create e-government in Ukraine. E-government is extremely important because it gives transparency between citizen and government. It makes the communication more effective. It cuts off the officials who could be corrupt. And it simply saves money, time, and creates distrust. Citizen to government, again, it's about trust. It's about creating the environment that people believe that all these reforms which are taking place, which are extremely hard, the winter is going to be very tough, that they have to happen. The mandate was extremely high for Poroshenko. In history, no one of the presidents have had so high mandate really in all regions where the elections took place. Unfortunately, in several elections didn't take place. Poroshenko won. And it is a very, very big trust and hope placed in his hands. And it is extremely important that this time he succeeds. He hasn't had attempts yet, but still it is a very good signal that people, again, are willing to give a chance for government and willing to support the measures, even if they're very hard to handle. But they believe it is for the good cause. Trust between business and government. It is very important to have the working legislation in place and working taxation system, meaning the ease of doing business, not just imitate the improving in ease of doing business indexes, but to really improve the doing business. That businesses wouldn't have to be afraid of the taxation officers, that the laws couldn't be interpreted in a way someone would like to interpret them, to simplify the taxation system, the legislation system. And if you have certain problems, you would always know that court would protect your rights. Not that in 99% of cases government wins, but you really believe that your rights would be protected if it is needed. Meaning the business would trust the government. It is important that actually government trusts the municipalities. There has been a lot of talk about decentralization, and I really do believe it is one of the key points that the local municipalities have more power, have a power and ways to decide upon their local needs. That it is not centralized in Kiev, that whether some local municipality should, let's simplify it, have a kindergarten rebuilt or restored, or whether they should spend money on building a new school. The local municipalities should have a power to decide and to be responsible. Extremely important to be responsible of their local budget. You cannot dictate from the center and then expect people to be really loyal for your written agenda, really. And it is not, definitely not the federalization which Russia keeps pushing for. It is just simply, in a European way, more trust and opportunities to make their own decisions in regions. And then there is a investors' trust to Ukraine. And 3 weeks ago, a meeting took place where approximately 30 Ukrainian venture capital and private equity market participants took part, and I'm very happy to say actually that few of them are also participating here, also IBRD. And first time in 7 years, investors came together and decided that this is a time to step up and to give positive signals to the market. They were from different sectors. There were industrial groups, leading industrial group. There were IBRD, leading PE investment funds like Horizon Capital. There were IT investors, and they all decided that actually now it is the time. That despite of war, of course, yes, let's call it a war. It's not anti-terror operation. It's now a war, and but still Israel is at war. But it's still a country with huge IT opportunities. The technology is boosting lots of possibilities for investors. We cannot say that Ukraine is only at war. There, for example, in IT, there are 100,000 people working in IT. It's one of the biggest markets in Europe. It has huge potential despite of politics. And the investors that came together decided that now first is the time to continue investing in Ukraine. They're not pulling back. The message should be sent to the market that despite of what's going on, the local investors are not pulling back, that the reforms should take place. And actually, the investors did have a high hope that this time the reforms would succeed. And it was very interesting to hear that there are very different investors, from the young generation, young IT generation, up to the elderly who have been in business for 20 years. And the elder one asked that, but what makes us succeed this time? And the younger guy, 30 plus something, answered, because I know these people who are making the reforms. I know personally the Shimkiv, who is the head of President Administration. We can call them and tell them what they should do. It's a little bit simplified, the way I answer, but still, it's the generation had changed. They're in a good way, in a bad way, but still they're new people really, and also investors and are putting trust in them because they feel something has changed and now is the momentum to push the changes, to give the new hope, to give the new messages, and maybe this time we would be heard, we will be heard, we're already being heard because there are new people. And so when we were deciding of what committees to establish in this venture and private equity association, the most popular was reforms and legislation and invest in Ukraine, because every member, now out of 20, and we still have the joining process ongoing, all of the members wanted to be part of Invest in Ukraine, because they do believe themselves, and they themselves are investing in Ukraine. So I would like to finish with this positive message that the local investors believe. Why wouldn't you give a chance?
Thank you, Nika. I think these are highly positive messages. If I can just pick up on that point, I think in terms of, you mentioned the likes of Dmitry Shimkiv and the reformers that are actually doing something. There was a very interesting article by Yulia Mostova in Zerkalo Nedeli, Zerkalo Tizhnya last week about, she was comparing that Ukrainians have already learnt how to control the government, but they haven't had the opportunity to really implement the changes needed. 6 months have passed since the new governments have been in place. Why do you think it's taking so long for actual sort of reforms to take place? I mean, the likes of, as Tim said, this is probably the best administration that Ukraine has had, but some are already leaving. Sheremetyev came, lots of expectation, and he's gone. So what do you think, why is it taking so long? And do you think the likes of Shimkiv, Groisman, will they stay, or will at some stage they'll just say, I can't do it, and they'll go back?
Well, if we're talking about Groisman, I personally have a quite high belief and hope in him, because he knows also the system from within. He was the mayor of Vinnytsia, and he was quite popular, or actually very popular mayor. So, but I think it is the conflict about, as mentioned, old generation, not so much about the age, but about the principles of, let's say, governing Ukraine, and the conflict between old and new generation. Meaning that, of course, it is very challenging for a person like Sheremetyev, who would like to do everything properly, correctly, transparently, to meet this opposition from the people who wouldn't so much like to change the ways, or let's say, okay, let's change the ways, but not tomorrow. Let's wait for a while. And it is not a short-term struggle. It will be, I believe, a long-term struggle. But that's why I mentioned that it's very important for people to trust that we're going the right way, and it's not 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 months. Actually, Mr. Sheremetyev asked from us, from representatives of Estonia, okay, what could be done in 3 months to show very fast results? And we said that in 3 months, you cannot have a very big, huge, significant Ukraine changing results, but you can show the way, that it is a positive way where we're going, and it is a constructive way we're going. So I think 6 months, yes, but many of these people haven't been in for 6 months. If we're talking about Shevkin, we're measuring it probably in a few months, in 2 months maybe. So I don't think they have been for so long that we can already judge. And as said, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint, unfortunately. So I still believe there is a big chance that the marathon direction is chosen the right way.
Okay, thank you. Well, now I'd like to open the floor to questions. If you could just, when you ask a question, please put your hand up and introduce yourself. I mean, before any sort of questions, I mean, question to Andrei, in terms of the opportunities, I mean, sort of traditional question about the 3 sectors. I mean, has anything changed? I mean, what are the 3 sectors that the EBRD will be focusing on? I mean, is there anything that is changing, or what are the 3 traditional sectors that you would suggest have the potential for greatest opportunity investments?
Well, I guess it hasn't really changed over the past year. To have an efficient and effective economy, you need to have a financial sector that is in good health. Banking, but also other financial market operators. That's one. And then the second portion of the economy is really the real economy, and the ones particularly that are either exporting enterprises or those that replace imports. I think that is kind of crucial for a country like Ukraine in particular, because there is a huge deficit of hard currency, and one needs to resolve the situation largely through export. So that makes agribusiness very important. That still keeps the metals industry as a very important resource. Hopefully that will not be totally broken after the conflict.
Okay, thanks. Yes, please, we have a question. We have a roving microphone. If you can just introduce yourself, please, your name and your affiliation.
Yes, hi, Mariana Kozintseva, Stonefund Consulting. I have a couple of questions. First of all, one of the biggest elephants in the room is October 26 parliamentary elections. I would like to ask Mr. Kuzmenko, first and foremost, how that is going to impact the process of Ukraine's integration with the EU. The second question that I have is on Ukraine's real growth, and that is one of the biggest impediments.
Ukraine's what, sorry?
Real growth. One of the biggest impediments to Ukraine's growth beyond the financial system was huge underinvestment in fixed assets. And the reason for it was precisely financial systems mismanagement. When you have local deposit rates at 20 to 25%, it's nearly impossible to invest in the real economy. It ends up a result going to be a consumer credit creation and auto credit creation, which has totally run amok. So I'm very curious to see if there are any specific programs that you see, Andrea, with respect to how that could be addressed with the help of EBRD. And my last question is going to be to Tim, and that is, I completely agree on the fact that there has to be a debt restructuring program for Ukraine, that the interest has been misplaced by placing interests of foreign stakeholders over those of Ukraine's internal stakeholders. What levers does Ukraine and international community have to reshape the process where IMF has really got its head in the wrong place?
Thank you.
Thank you.
So early parliamentary elections. First of all, why we do have them? It is obvious that the structure and the composition of the current parliament, which was elected during the time of President Yanukovych, does not correspond neither the political and social structure of the modern Ukrainian society, nor, let's say, advanced development and very fast development of the social field, I mean, in terms of the political environment, let's say, in Ukraine. We do have full understanding that the new parliament will be much more pro-European, much more pro-democratic, and it will be, which is more important, much more capable.
Thank you. Andrew?
Yeah, I guess the question about real economy versus a more, real growth on a sustainable manner versus more speculative, as you mentioned, consumer credit and basically trading activity, because if the interest rates are very high, then what happens is that, you have to be very quick with your money. You buy something at 10 and you sell it at 15, and it doesn't matter that if you do it within a week, it doesn't matter that the annual interest rate is 40%. But it has to do with trust. It has to do with the long-term versus short-term. You need to have investors that know what they're doing, be them local enterprises that have been in the market, that then can freely operate and under truly fair competitive environment, or foreign enterprises that feel that look, Ukraine has the relevant human capital, it has the relevant size, it has the relevant resources, and we want to invest. I mean, it has to do with the trust. If there is no trust, nobody, makes a long-term commitment to Ukraine. And it again starts domestically. What really was striking when I moved to Ukraine in 2008 was this complete distrust. Employees do not trust their management, citizens do not trust the government, you don't trust your neighbor, and sometimes you don't trust your family. I found that, totally striking. And hopefully now, the new Ukraine that is being created will have less of divisions, and that will have more long-term view, and will have more trust.
Tim, on the IMF?
I mean, I guess I can understand perhaps from an IMF and White House perspective why they didn't do a debt restructuring in the first place, because their priorities were getting a program together as soon as possible, as big as possible, and the focus was on as much as possible, and it was very challenging at the time, if you remember, given because no one really seemed to have any cash. Getting $1 billion US loan guarantee was painfully slow, and then the Europeans coming up with a bit of small change that was already available. I mean, the Europeans don't really have any program specific for a country like Ukraine, unfortunately. So I can kind of understand why they decided not to go down that route. I mean, I would have argued doing it at the outset when a country like Ukraine could have blamed the previous administration and said this debt was accumulated by a corrupt regime, we're not responsible for it, you know, we want a clean, fresh start, let's wipe the slate clean, move on. We're not going to be able to access capital markets anyway for a year or two, so, you know, a restructuring is not going to impact us. I think the advice, you know, Ukraine needs to get some decent advisors that think outside the box, know the IMF, how they work, and basically it's your program. If you say to the fund, you know, we're facing I was going to swear, but I won't swear. We are facing an invasion. You know, the very survival of this state is at threat. You know, we have to prioritize our spending, and paying 1.5 billion for a naphtha gas bond in September, we'd rather buy a load of missiles from Israel or Serbia or wherever. If the Europeans, I mean, there's no legal restriction on Ukraine buying arms from the European Union. They just don't want to sell them to you at the moment, but there's lots of other places you could. But I mean, you know, the government needs to get its priorities right. And I think there's been too much listening to the West, hoping the West had all the solutions and would help you guys out. And the reality has fallen well short of that. And I think, you know, maybe Ukrainians should take some of the initiative in their own hands and you know, they have, I mean, you know, the Myria restructuring that is ongoing. I mean, you know, if you look at the external financing requirements of Ukraine, I mean, we've seen the current account deficit shrink through exchange rate adjustment, domestic depreciation, domestic deflation, and some restructuring at the corporate level. I think it's at the public sector level. You know, if at the end of all this, Ukraine ends up 2 years down the line with a public sector debt GDP ratio of 100%, which is quite likely the way things are going on the security situation, and then it has to restructure, everyone's going to blame the Poroshenko administration at that point in time for cocking up and not managing the economy in a very clever way. Whereas if you did it relatively early, you could blame the previous administration. So, you know, Russia restructured in, I mean, interestingly, a client who was very long Ukrainian Eurobonds said to me 3 months ago or something like that, actually a bit longer, you know, tell me a country, I mean, one of the arguments not for restructuring at the time was at the end of 2013, your public sector debt GDP ratio was 43%, not very high. And if you look at the IMF program, again, 56.5 was the assumption earlier on this year when they put the program together. And the client said to me, well, name me a country that restructured with a public sector debt GDP ratio of 56.5%. I said, Russia in 98. It had a debt GDP ratio of 55 at the time that it restructured. And Russia was investment grade 5 years later. You know, sometimes countries can't meet their debt liabilities and they have to restructure. And investors are big boys and they understand it. It's part of the game. Countries move on, and it helps countries. It gives countries a break, and I think, you know, why it wasn't, you know, again, I mean, I've made my views pretty clear. It's part of the solution. Ignoring the fact is head in the sand. The IMF, the White House, the Europeans, NATO. You know, you said they've got their heads somewhere. Heads in the sand as opposed to somewhere else. But that's the reality.
Yes, please, sir.
Again, my name is Sean with Guest Consulting Ukraine, and we're on the ground every day. We were on the ground then, before you went to Yanukovych, during the Maidan, all the way through. We haven't left. We've stayed with it. First of all, I appreciate Timothy's comments. A lot of them are right on. But one of the things that we see right now is that the country is actually galvanized in a nationalistic way from the cutoff of the Russian gas. I think the Russian gas cutoff is actually the best thing that could ever happen to Ukraine. It's and what we see, and I ask you this, Timothy, is that, or Tim, what we see is our businesses tripled, or doubled, or tripled in the last 60 days because of the Russian aggression. We specialize in energy efficiency, cogeneration. Our staff's gone from, in 1 year, from myself and an assistant to we're approaching 10 or 15 coming up. So actually our business is growing dramatically, and the Russian cutoff of gas is actually dramatically affected in a positive way, and I see many more things happening. As a matter of fact, I see a switch where we have an office in the United States and we have an office in Ukraine, and I see our partners and investors switching to wanting to focus more on Ukraine than they do the United States. It's just a high rate of return and high opportunities. And the question that I see as well is, and I can ask the board, who has, I think, somewhat much more knowledge than I do, but we were just in Odessa last week, which, by the way, I drove down to Odessa very calmly in beautiful country and drove back with no absolute problems at all. But the one thing that we're seeing is we're seeing calls, quickly, because decentralization, for example, at the university level is allowing them to make decisions on autonomously and move forward. And it's presenting huge opportunities virtually overnight. We're getting calls from Zaporozhye region, Odessa regions. We have more calls than we can field at this point. So that was some of my questions. Where do you see the autonomous ability for the municipalities going, and also too, where do you see the issues with the reduction in gas as a positive? Because that's how we see it.
Okay, and we'll take one question here. Yep.
Hi, it's actually not a question. It's maybe a comment, if I can make.
Okay, you can just keep it short. Please.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about investing in Ukraine. Maybe ironically, I happen to run a fundraising project for Ukraine in a wartime, and I approached, I counted out of interest, 398 potential investors who invest in Ukraine, and interest was just 5% of them showed interest to consider further. Then I took another parallel, 5% of Ukraine is in war. Is it any link between that? 5% of territory of Ukraine. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting, observation for me. Bottom line is, I think Ukraine is going through exciting times, challenging, extraordinary, set chance to build its own country. But I think strategic investors, be them local or foreigners, have fantastic opportunity not to wait too long if they want to generate super return. Because the moment Ukraine is in peace, probably the train gone. It depends what's your appetite. If you are opportunistic investor, you go now. Yeah. You are bold, you go now. If you are looking for more, like average return, very safe return, then you have to follow the rules of safe return,
Thank you.
You go later.
Thank you. We have two questions. There's a gentleman in the middle and the lady at the front.
I wondered if all of you, sorry, Natasha Duff from Bloomberg News. I wondered if all of you could comment.
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sorry, Natasha Duff from Bloomberg News.
From where?
Bloomberg News. I wondered if all of you could comment on the news this morning that there has been a ceasefire agreement between Putin and Poroshenko, which the Russians have already almost denied because they said they're not a party to the conflict. I wondered if you could just comment on how likely you think such an agreement could be, how likely a negotiated settlement to the conflict is, and what implications that might have. Thank you.
Thank you. And the gentleman in the middle.
My name is Peter Dixon. I'm the commercial director at JKX, Oil and Gas. We've been one of the biggest investors in the energy sector in Ukraine for 20 years or so. Sorry to burst the enthusiasm of the panel, but I don't share your enthusiasm about the quality of the current administration. I don't know if you're aware, but at this time when there is no import of gas from Russia, it's particularly important that the government does all that it can to encourage foreign investors who are already in the country to continue to produce gas. On August the 1st of this year, the government passed a new bill which is doubling the taxation on the production of gas. This is illogical, and despite our efforts to lobby in the government, it's been pushed through without any recourse and without any consultation. This is a retrograde step, and it bemoans the policy of the government and the advice. Tim mentioned maybe is it the government's initiative, or is it a means to actually subscribe to an IMF condition? I'm not party to that. I'd be interested in your comments if that's the case. Thank you.
Okay. So we have 4 questions, and I'll hand it to the panel. Start with Inigo, please.
Thank you. In regards to Putin, yes, in regards to Putin, I personally, and I think many share the belief, don't believe anything that Vladimir Putin says, anything. He has let down so many times, and even before that. So I think it is just another, either it's warm words or it's just something that he likes someone to believe. I don't believe anything in Putin says. And I think Baltic countries have been pretty direct and straightforward towards not believing just simple words. He hasn't justified any words. I think that Europe and USA should reconsider not supplying Ukraine with arms. I still think Europe and USA should start supplying Ukraine with arms. Well, Ukraine, are in war for Europe, not only Ukraine, it's war for Europe, and we should start understanding that. There is no negotiation anymore. That time has passed a long time ago. You can't negotiate with terrorists, which is invading your country. You should protect Ukraine and Europe for these terrorists. So I'm sorry, no, I don't believe in Putin, and I think it's time that Europe as well stops believing Putin.
Thank you, Nikom. Andrei?
This is a very relevant question, how to manage with the situation in the east of our country. But there is a very clear response how to do that. There is a peaceful plan of President Poroshenko, which foresees regaining control over the state border, release of under the monitoring of the OSCE, release of all the hostages, and ceasefire. At this very stage, it seems to be, this plan will be should be reinforced with the demand to pull out and to withdraw of all the Russian militaries, all Russian troops from the territory of Ukraine. And then, if it will be implemented, the very last request, you will see that nobody is holding the arms against the Ukrainian armed forces. And on this basis, the peace could be reached with and these actions be followed by the, let's say, peaceful steps and the social steps at the territory. First of all, we have to cope with coming winter season, help the people to avoid the humanitarian tragedy, which will be unavoidable if the territory be under the control of terrorists.
Tim, the 2 questions, one's about the autonomy for municipalities.
Actually, can I? I'm a little bit naughty in doing this, but can I ask maybe the audience? I mean, you raised an interesting point that you think that Poroshenko should not negotiate with terrorists, separatist terrorists in the East. I mean, of the audience, I mean, do you think he should not negotiate with terrorists? Can we have maybe a straw poll of people in the audience? He should not negotiate with terrorists. Who thinks that there should be no negotiation with terrorists?
I'm sorry if I can add.
Okay.
Yes, if I can add or clarify. You should always have negotiations anyway, but you should also answer the aggression. It is a little bit more clarifying, meaning that, of course, if peaceful solution could be found, brilliant. But at that point, it is not only about negotiations.
Actually, can I ask a different question to the audience, which is basically, do you think Poroshenko should negotiate peace at any cost? So basically just agree to whatever Putin decides. I mean, does anyone think that it's peace at any cost? So we have one person out of the audience thinks that peace is worthwhile at any cost, whatever it means. It means end of European integration, no NATO, all the Maidan aspirations. It would mean a coalition administration also. I mean, Yanukovych back, and you think that's worthwhile doing, if it means people don't die.
Remember when we had the IRA conflict in this country? You know, for some reason USA and Europe, excuse me for my voice, never supplied any weapons, right? Why should we be supplying Ukraine with weapons? Because the terrorists are taking place. You know, we really need to think, because it's the civilians and children are suffering at the end.
Thank you for your comment, and I would really oppose this. You see, we all use here term terrorist, which really created after 9/11 events, and it's a very popular term nowadays. And it's probably a wrong term to use toward Russia or any Russian-Ukrainian conflict, because let's back to old terminology. We facing KGB. Man, we facing Soviet style, and I used to live like 35 years, so I remember this very well, and I know what does it mean, these three horrible, very horrible letters, KGB. And this country, under these rules, will not stop invade or affect in any military, political, economical, any. They will torture today Ukraine, tomorrow Baltic, after tomorrow Poland, Czechia, because of KGB. It's not terrorism. It's Soviet style. It's similar what world Europe faced in 1956 in Budapest, in 1968 in Prague, in early 80s in Poland, and which create disturbance around the world. This is regime which create disturbance and supply weaponry in Middle East, in Israel-Palestinian conflict.
Thank you.
And
if I can just
so
cut off there, because we're running out of time for the coffee break, and we'll be happy to discuss this. If I can just...
which negotiation with pro-fascist KGB regime could be reached? No way.
Thank you. Andriy Kuzmenko.
Well, actually, we should use the term terrorist, and probably this is the reality. And all the terrorists on the world use the same tactic, which was introduced in Donetsk: human shield, sporadic fire, and now we know whom they have learned this tactic from. That is why probably the terrorism is the secret weapon of that country, at that regime you were talking about.
Can I answer the question?
Yeah.
So
the question about the gas, or?
Well, I can answer both actually, but I mean, unless it's the easy one, which is the gas question. I mean, I think this is basically the bottom line is you've got a government and they have to make choices, right? And you've got an IMF program that, because the macro assumptions were not realistic, you end up with a bigger budget deficit and the numbers don't work, so you have to have fiscal adjustment, right? So you've got to find savings from somewhere. What do you cut? Do you cut pensions? Do you cut wages? Do you hike taxes? Also with an administration that has increased spending on the military. So unfortunately, the energy sector have taken a hit. But again, should it be the energy sector or should it be private creditors? I mean, should you be paying private creditors this year, or should you be raising taxes on the energy sector, given that energy security should be absolutely top of the pile? I mean, you're completely right. I mean, Ukraine should be boosting production, should be encouraging investment in the energy sector as a top priority. It should be right up there. So I would agree with you. It's about the priorities. It's about the priorities set by the administration and not set by Washington. This is important, right? Washington has a different agenda. Ukraine, unfortunately, Ukraine is very high it's number one for Putin, right? In terms, when he gets up in the morning, Ukraine is the first thing he thinks about. For Obama, it's about number 5, unfortunately. So in the Washington, anyway, let's not go there. But anyway, in terms of the question about the ceasefire and the conflict, I mean, I wrote something earlier this week, and I had 3 scenarios basically from what we're seeing develop, particularly after the intervention south to Mariupol. And basically, for Poroshenko, he faces 3 choices. Let's face it. 1. He caves in, he agrees a ceasefire deal with Putin that basically, great federalization, increased autonomy for Donbass,
basically a veto, in essence, by Donbass or these separatists on Ukraine's Western orientation. I'd set a very low probability on that. It's almost impossible for Poroshenko to sell that at home, less than 10%. If he tries to deliver on that, he's lost the parliamentary elections, he has no credibility, his political capital has eroded because 3,000 people have died. I mean, it's changed Ukraine. So very low probability on that. The other scenarios are, basically some kind of ceasefire, but no long-lasting solution over Donbass. Russian troops stay in Donbass. In essence, it's a frozen conflict. Ukraine tries to move on. Poroshenko tries to continue the Western orientation, Western reforms, all that kind of stuff, but hugely difficult given Donbass is 16% of GDP, 27% industrial output, huge steel plants, huge coal plants, transport hub, and I think very debatable and doubtful support from the West. But I'd attach maybe a 35-40% probability on that scenario. It's kind of a muddling through with a huge burden on Ukraine. And the other scenario is, in the end, a full-blown conflict. We have a proper war between Ukraine and Russia, and that's and there's a winner and there's a loser, right? But and Ukraine tries to exact as much pain on the Russian invasion force as possible. It might lose, it might stop the Russian tanks, etc. But again, I'd put a fairly high probability also on that kind of scenario. Because basically Poroshenko would not deliver on Putin's agenda, and Putin wouldn't like it and say, fine, I'm going in the east anyway, right? I mean, that's the kind of scenario. So.
Okay. Well,
good options there.
On that note, it's already gone. It's 11 o'clock. So I would like to, on behalf of everybody here, thank the panel for their great insights and analysis, and invite everybody to the coffee break. And we're back here at 11:30 for the next panel on the investors' outlook in Ukraine. So thank you, everybody, and see you back 11:30. Thank you.